All right, so we'll start with 1.2, which is about algebra and composition with functions. So we'll talk about operations with and compositions of functions and how that relates to and what are the profit, revenue, and cost functions. So let's start with what is a function. So a function is a rule that assigns to every input exactly one output. Right? Everything that you can plug in is called the domain. So you plug things into the function from the domain. And since it's a function, it's going to spit out only one thing for everything that you plug in. All of the things that it spits out, all of the outputs, is called the range. So let's look at some examples of that. How about if I have f of x is 0.3048x? What that is going to do is take an input, which is a distance, in meters, and the output will give the equivalent distance in feet. Right? And so that's a function because for whatever x value I plug in, whatever distance in meters, there's only one thing that's the exact same distance in feet. So it's a function because for every input, a distance in meters, I get exactly one output, a distance in feet. Something that's not an example is a rule where I input a letter and output a name that starts with that letter. So for example, if I input the letter J, I can output John. But then I could do it again and this time output James or Jack or whatever, right? So for something like that, that's not a function because you can have one output J that has multiple, one input J that has multiple outputs, John, James, or whatever. So that's not a function. Okay, so now that we know what functions are, we can start doing things with them, right? So let's say that f and g are two functions where they're going to take an input, usually we call that a variable x, and then they'll output a number, usually when what we deal with. Then if you write this symbol f plus g or f minus g of x, right? That's what this says here, f plus g of x or f minus g of x. You can just add those two functions together on the outside. If you have two functions and you write this symbol f times g of x, that means you do f of x and then multiply that by g of x. If you have f divided by g of x, that means you take f of x and divide by g of x. And then this symbol, that little circle, is a composition. So this reads f composed with g, or f of g of x. Means that you take g of x and plug that into f of x. One important thing here is that this guy is only defined whenever g of x is not 0, because we're not allowed to divide by 0. Let's look at two functions f and g and put this into practice. So let's find f plus g of x. So f plus g of x, what is that? Well, f plus g of x, that means that we're going to take f of x and add to it g of x. And what is that? Well, we copy down f of x and copy down g of x. So that's 2x plus 3 plus x minus 4. Right? And it might help to just put parentheses around f and g. And then we can combine some like terms here and we'll get 3x, right? 2x plus 1x, and then a 3 minus 4 gives us a minus 1. So there is f plus g of x. It's 3x minus 1. We added f of x to g of x. What about f minus g of x? Well, for that, the rule says that you do f of x and subtract, whoops, sorry about that. You do f of x and subtract g of x. So we get 2x plus 3, copying down f of x. And then we're going to subtract g of x, which is x minus 4. And what do we get when we do that? Well, we have a 2x minus x is x, and then don't forget to distribute this negative sign. So you get 3 plus 4 is plus 7. So there's f minus g of x. What about fg, or f times g of x, right? So these are all functions of x, and fg of x, or f times g of x, is f of x times g of x. So that's 2x plus 3, copying down f of x, times x minus 4, copying down g of x. And I'm not going to bother distributing that out. This is fine as is. If you wanted to distribute out, you can. What about f over g, or f divided by g of x? What is that? Well, for that, we take f of x and divide it by g of x. So f of x is 2x plus 3. G of x is x minus 4. And there it is, f of x over g of x. Okay, now, what about f of g, or f composed with g of x? So remember, what that means is that you are going to plug the whole function g of x into that function f. Right, so remember, f is 2x plus 3. So f of g of x means that instead of a 2x plus 3, it's going to be 2gx plus 3. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that instead of this x here, we're going to plug in whatever's on the inside of this parentheses, right? Instead of an x inside the parentheses, we have a gx. So I still have a 2, and then instead of an x, what do I have? I have a gx. Oops. All right, so it's 2 times g of x plus 3. And now what is g of x? Well, g of x is x minus 4, so this is 2 times x minus 4 instead of a g of x. So 2 times x minus 4 plus 3. So since a g of x was on the inside of these parentheses instead of an x, we plugged in g of x instead of an x. And then we substitute in what g of x was equal to. And what do we get now? And here I'll just use one color. We get a 2x. So 2x, and then minus 8. But minus 8 plus 3, we only get minus 5. So that is f of g of x, 2x minus 5. We plugged g of x into f. Okay, now what about g of f of x? So here we're going to do this in the other order. So what that means is we are going to take g, and instead of plugging in x, we're going to plug in f of x. All right, so here I'm going to let you do this slide on your own. Instead of plugging in x, you notice that we are going to start plugging in numbers to these guys. And so what that means is you just find the function that we had on the last slide and then plug in x equals 2 to all of them. Right? But I'll let you guys do that on your own. Okay, so now what are this profit, revenue, and cost we talked about? So this is business calculus, so we need to start talking about some business, of course, businessy things. Profit, revenue, and cost are very much related to business. So revenue, we'll start with that. We usually use capital R of X, so it's a function of X. And here X is the number of things that we're selling. And R of X, the revenue, that's the amount of money taken in, right? So you sell X things and you take in R of X amount of money, right? So that you can think of that as it's the amount of money sort of in the cash register after you've sold X things, right? Something like that. And how do we find that? Well, if I'm selling X things and I want to know how much money I'm taking in, well, that's the number of things sold times how much I sold them for. So that's my price times the number of things. So that's X times P, where here P represents my price. Right? So X is my number of items and P is my price. So revenue is XP, where X is the number of items and P is the price. Cost, we usually denote capital C of X. That's the cost that it is to produce X items. Right, so that's a variable cost plus a fixed cost. You don't need to know that necessarily. The main idea here is that C of X is the cost, which is the cost to produce X items. And that allows us to write down the profit, right? So profit, that's the amount of money you made. So how do you find that? Well, you say, this is the amount of money I've taken in, my revenue, but I need to account for what I already spent, which is my cost. So that means that the amount of money that we make is the profit, which is revenue, amount of money taken in, minus cost, which is the amount of money spent. And that's the amount of money you made. And for that, we use capital P of X. And so with our functions there, that says that P of X is R of X minus C of X, right? Profit is revenue minus cost. Okay, so let's look at an example now. It says Penny knows that the number of watermelons she can sell each week, X, is related to the price per watermelon, P, by X equals 29 minus P. What price should Penny charge for each watermelon if she wants the weekly revenue to be $100? Right, so we're trying to figure out something about revenue, but what we should do first is write down an equation for the revenue. Right, so the revenue of selling X things is X times P, right? Remember that from the last slide. But over here we have that X is 29 minus P. So we can write that as 29 minus P times P, right? We subbed in 29 minus P for X. And now since it says how much should she charge, we're looking for the price, right? So that tells us find P. Oops. We're looking for the price. Price equals what? To make the revenue equal to $100. So what we're going to do is take this equation for revenue and set it equal to $100. So that's 100 equals 29 minus P times P. So now we have to remember, how do we solve a quadratic equation? Well, let's distribute this right side. We get 29P minus P squared. And the way we want to solve these quadratics is to get a 0 on one side of the equation. So how do we get a 0 on the left side? Well, let's subtract 100. And we get 29P minus P squared minus 100. It might be easier if we wrote this as P squared, or minus P squared, plus 29P minus 100. And now you can do one of two things here. You can factor this thing and try to write it as a factored expression on the right-hand side. And then you can set each of those terms, each factor, equal to 0 and find your answer. Or you can use the quadratic equation. If you want to use the quadratic equation, that's great, but I don't think you'll need it in this class. Everything that we look at should factor. So how does this factor? Well, if we pull a negative out, then that gives us, multiplying both sides by -1. 0 times -1 is still 0. But that lets us write this as p squared, which is just a little nicer to see how this factors. So we get a minus 29p instead of a plus 29p, and then a plus 100 instead of a minus 100. Now hopefully you all remember how to factor from pre-cal, and so what does that factor into? Well, we need two factors of 100 that add up to -29, so how about -25 and -4? Right, so p minus 4 times p minus 25. So then you set each one of those equal to 0 individually, and we get p minus 4 equals 0. So p equals 4. So that means if Penny charges $4 a watermelon, she'll have a revenue of 100. And then p minus 25 equals 0. Gives us p equals 25. And that's all we're doing in 1.2. So there's the homework. Get you familiar with functions and composition and profit, revenue, and cost.